continue with curious questions on the meaning of life from Qohelet, and we are now entering into chapter 8. מי כהחכם ומי יודע פשר דבר, חוכמת אדם תאיר פניו ועוז פניו ישונה. אני פי מלך שמור ועל דברת שבועות אלוהים, אל תיבהל מפניו. תלך אל תעמוד בדברה, כי כל אשר יחפוץ יעשה. באשר דבר מלך שלטון, ומי אמר לו מה תעשה. שומר מצוות לא ידע דבר רע, ועת ומשפט ידע לב חכם. כי לכל חפץ יש עת ומשפט, כי רעת אדם רבה עליו, כי איננו יודע מה שיהיה, כי כאשר יהיה, מי יגיד לו? אין אדם שליט ברוח, לכלוא את הרוח, ואין שלטון ביום המוות, ואין משלחת במלחמה, ולא ימלא את רשע את בעליו. את כל זה ראיתי ונתון את ליבי לכל מעשה אשר נעשה תחת השמש. עת אשר שלט האדם באדם לרע לו, ובכן ראיתי רשעים כפורים ובאו ממקום קדוש, יהלכו וישתחכו בעיר אשר כן עשו, גם זה הבל אשר אין נעשה פתגם מעשה הרעה מהרה, על כן מלא לב בני האדם בהם לעשות רע. אשר חוטא עושה רע מעט ומאריך לו, כי גם יודע אני אשר יהיה טוב ליראי האלוהים, אשר יראו מלפניו, וטוב לא יהיה לרשע, ולא יאריך ימים קצר, אשר איננו ירא מלפני אלוהים. יש הבל אשר נעשה על הארץ, אשר יש צדיקים, אשר מגיע עליהם כמעשה רשעים, ויש רשעים שמגיע עליהם כמעשה צדיקים. אמרתי שגם זה הבל. ושיבחתי אני את השמחה, אשר אין טוב לאדם תחת השמש, כי אם לאכול ולשתות ולשמוח, והוא ילבנו בעמלו ימי חייו אשר נתנו אלוהים תחת השמש. כאשר נתתי את ליבי לדעת חוכמה ולראות את העניין אשר נעשה על הארץ, כי גם ביום ובלילה שינה בעיניו איננו רואה. וראיתי את כל מעשה אלוהים, כי לא יוכל האדם למצוא את המעשה אשר נעשה תחת השמש, בשל אשר יעמול האדם לבקש ולא ימצא, וגם אם יאמר החכם לדעת לא יוכל למצוא. I'm now going to turn to the translation I'm providing for chapter 8. Marion, if you can lead us in that reading, please.
None compared to the wise one who knows the way of all things. Such knowing brings light to the face and softens one's features. So let me counsel you, stay on the way of the royal path, as though it is the reality of God. Do not run from truth, insisting upon bending what is to conform to what you desire. Reality is what it is. It is you who must do the bending. For reality flows of its own accord. A sovereign's word is power and belongs to that which is. You cannot bend the whole and say, what are you doing? One who tends the way of all things avoids unnecessary suffering, and the wise of heart knows the time of judgment. For every happening has a time of judgment. For humans, evil weighs heavy upon each person. For one knows not what will be, who can tell of it? Just as you cannot command the wind, just as you cannot ward off the day of death, just as you cannot ensure there is sending away from war, so you cannot escape the consequences of your deeds. Evil consumes veil, good invites good. All this I have seen, even applied my heart thereto. Whatever the work that is done under the sun, what time one man had power over another to another to his hurt. All this I have seen as I studied the role of power in the world. Whenever you seek power over another, no matter how politely you excuse, it is seeded with evil. Whether the wicked brought to the grave, and from a holy place they went forth, while those who did right were forgotten in the town, this too is mere breath. The sentence for an evil act is not executed swiftly. So I have seen the name of the vile reviled by their children, and the just forgotten, even by those blessed by their deeds. Some see the success of the wicked and follow their lead, seeking riches through evil. Sometimes it works, but in the end, evil eats itself and those who serve it. It shall be well with those who revere God, that are awestruck before the presence. And the wicked cannot abide by truth, so they construct a world of life that ultimately collapses of its own weight, crushing them beneath the folly of their own illusory shadow, because such a person does not revere God. There is a thing of mere breath that is done on the earth. There are righteous to whom it befalls as though they did wickedly, and there are wicked to whom it befalls as though they did it righteously. I said that this too is mere breath. So cease your agonizing and rejoice. There is nothing better for you than this under the sun, than to eat and enjoy what you eat. Drink and enjoy what you drink. Do this, and tranquility will accompany you throughout the trials and throughout the days of your life that God give you under the sun. When I set my heart to know all that passes for wisdom, to perceive all that takes place on earth, and to uncover the way of reality that is written on the heart of every being, I realize that I cannot reduce the whole to the limit of the part. Day and night I remain sleepless. Then I have seen all the work of God that no ordinary person can fathom the way under the sun. And even if the wise pretends to know, that person will be able to grasp it.
Great, thank you. So let's take a look at the text, and let's first see if there are any questions or observations that you have. Again, yes, Morton?
Well, I think it's very opaque. Is one problem I had with it.
Mm-hmm.
But
And were you paying attention to how many times it said in the JPS translation, meaning of the Hebrew uncertain?
yeah, right.
It's quite a few times. It's quite opaque. This is a tough one.
And but one of the things that comes through is that there's this seeming frustration that good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people.
Right. And what's that called?
I'm sorry?
What's the term for that conundrum that wisdom texts have to address? It has a name that we've talked about before together.
I can't remember.
Marion, do you remember?
Yes, hold on.
Right.
It's not theosophy, it's
No.
something.
Close. Theo is the first part.
Theodicy.
That's right. It's a theodicy.
Right.
Okay. So Tzaddik Veralo, Rasha V'Tovla, frustration that there are righteous people who suffer and the wicked seem to prosper. It's a fundamental conundrum that wisdom texts come to address. Okay, so you're noticing that feels very present. Yeah. Anything else?
And I mean, I guess I am not taken with the conundrum.
Oh, with the conundrum or with the
Yeah,
potential solution?
I guess I don't. The more he comes back to it, he or she, the more the text comes back to that, the less I think it's important.
Okay.
For some reason.
That's interesting. It seems to be a topic of interest, though,
Yes.
to Qohelet. The question is whether there's a compelling um, solution that is that's proposed. So right now it's opaque, but if there was a solution, then the larger question is does it really matter? Is it important? Is it important to you as a reader, and now, as well as to a reader or a listener who would have heard Qohelet that was assembling them at the time? Daphne, you have to unmute.
I have no comment.
Okay.
I didn't understand it completely, so I'll pass. Thank you.
Okay. Marion?
I think, this translation over the JPS shows something very interesting to me. He has certain phrases that he uses and repeats, and he talks about reality,
Mm-hmm.
and he talks about reality as that which is versus the whole and parts of the whole.
Mm-hmm.
That we can't understand the whole, we can only get glimpses of the parts
Mm-hmm.
of thing. We can't control the whole, we can't predict it. And it's a different perspective than we've seen in the other chapters, that even though the sense of not knowing is the same, the sense of frustration, the sense of not knowing, the
Mm-hmm.
sense of resignation, but the terminology here is different in this translation.
And what did you see in the JPS when they're looking at the part and the whole of reality? How does JPS render it differently? But remember, again, every translation here is an interpretation, but you did notice something important there.
It's so it starts in verse 2, the reality of God, and then verse 3, reality is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So in the JPS is quite different, so that his deep content is dissembled. I do obey the king's orders and don't rush into. I mean, it's almost like a totally different text.
Right. The king's orders already start to come up in verse 2, and that's something we have to talk about in terms of what's going on. But yeah, this is a very opaque section, so it requires a little bit more interpretation on the side of the translator, and it's difficult to penetrate. But let's hold that as one of our challenges. Anything else that other people notice before we go into it, Bev?
Just an observation. We're going through a lot of opaque texts, but then you get to 15 and beyond, and he's saying, or she, there's so much you can't know, there's so much you can't fathom, then take enjoyment from what you can. So you're eating and drinking and you're enjoying your life, and you'll never know everything that God has planned or has in store for you, but you can focus on what you can do, that kind of thing. So it sort of ends on a bit of a more hopeful note for me. You know, there's so much, if you spend your days trying to learn everything, then he says you're going to be sleepless day and night, and you won't be able to have any rest, but focus on what you can do. That kind of sort of comes through to me. I don't know.
So that is again a way of trying to address the frustration that emerges, that seems to be reaching. I don't know if it's a fever pitch, but it's reaching a place of sleeplessness now, right?
Right.
That's something that disturbs Qohelet. Marion, did you have your hand? Yeah.
Rabbi, did you ask us to look at this with Proverbs 31?
Well, that was from last time. We can talk about that in a moment together. What I wanted to do, and this is part of the larger issue of Qohelet, in chapter 7, I wanted you to make a comparison between Proverbs 1 through 9 and 31:11 to 31 to see about the personification of Chokhmah, of wisdom, specifically as a woman, the symbol of Chokhmah as a symbol of the woman, and the different ways it's portrayed in Proverbs. So I want to come back to that in a moment together, but I wanted to take a look at some of these verses and just see if we can try to polish some of the opaqueness, even though it will remain opaque. This is a tough chapter to really to polish. But let me share a couple thoughts. Okay.
Yes.
part of what's going on in verse 1 that's interesting, that we should take note of, is the relationship to the language, right? Some of the language does cue us in terms of chokhmah. It's talking about chokhmat adam, that is the wisdom of a human being. And there seems to be this this reference here to pesher davar that is translated here. It can be the meaning of an adage, or it can also to mean to know the way. I translated it here as to know the way, but pesher davar has a technical term that comes up in scripture, and we should just reflect on it for a moment. What Qohelet is suggesting here is that there are none who compare to the wise. After all, if you look at the models of the wise in scripture, then aside from Qohelet as King Solomon, if King Solomon now, or the Qohelet who takes on the mask of King Solomon, is looking through the rest of the characters throughout the Hebrew Bible, who would you say would exemplify two of the wisest of the wise characters in terms of their ability to be able to interpret reality, a pesher davar, or to know the meaning of an adage, to understand how to interpret a davar, which can mean 15 different things, but ultimately it means a word or a thing or anything of that sort, a matter, an experience. Who are the wisest interpreters in the Hebrew Bible?
Moshe.
The prophets.
Prophets, but Joseph as well, wasn't he?
Right. Okay. So we went through a few: Moses, the prophets, but Joseph is the first one. Why do we know that he is considered to be so wise? What is he able to interpret?
Dreams.
So he is considered to be one of the wisest, because in Genesis 40 through 41, through his ability to channel his wisdom to interpret the dreams, both not just of his brothers but also of Pharaoh, he ends up rising to power as the vizier of Egypt. So he is considered to be one who can interpret dreams, and this applied wisdom of pesher davar is very important in terms of his ascendancy to power, and the consideration that he is one of the wisest in the Bible. There's another character as well, parallel to Joseph, who also is a great dream interpreter, less commonly known and read. But who would that be? How about Daniel?
Oh, okay.
A text that we tend not to read very much in the Jewish community, but is a favorite in apocalyptic circles. So if you look at the book of Daniel, chapters 2, 4, 5, and 7, you'll see again that he is considered to be one who is competent in pesher davar and dream interpretation. So in this sense, they understand, especially before royalty, they have the capacity to be able to interpret and apply their wisdom to a universal situation and to guide a ruling power who is a king. So that's the context here, because now it's talking about the king's way that we should at least think that Qohelet may be referring to here, both given the language and the context. So part of what's important to remember is that both Daniel and Joseph represent this competency as being the ones who can apply their wisdom to interpret dreams and to advise the king. Okay, and that's important for knowing the way. The way here could be the royal path, or just the way in terms of the way of wisdom. Now, these dream interpretations that are conveyed by their interpreters, in both cases of Joseph and of Daniel, who do they credit for the inspiration of their interpretation?
God.
That's right. And that's another sign of their wisdom, right? Both in Genesis 41 and chapter 41, verses 38 through 39, as well as Daniel 2, verse 46, they both credit God for their ability to interpret pesher davar, is a wisdom that is bestowed upon a person who receives this and is attuned to the divine. That person, when this wisdom is bestows itself upon a person, then they become a little bit more conscious of who they are. They may become relaxed in appearance in relationship to the relationship of the head to the heart. The heart of the person begins to change and to shine through in their face, and that's part of what's being described here as well that the sign of a good heart is a radiant face. If your face radiates, that means that your heart is in a place of contentment. And when you're brooding, you have a sense of brooding sorrow, it evokes arduous thoughts. So there's something about the relationship that Qohelet is seeing here between the face and the heart. There was, of course, as well the ancient art of physiognomy, which was called chokhmat hapanim, the ability to look at someone's face. Not only could someone who was a dream interpreter interpret dreams, but they could look at your face and determine the state of your heart, as well as later on the state of your soul. So wisdom is here, what Qohelet is saying, makes a person's face shine. And sometimes if power is misused, it can also distort the radiance of the face. Now, what's interesting is that both Joseph and Daniel were wise, but the power that they received from the application of their wisdom has the potential to become distorted, right? So part of these examples also show us that there are limits to wisdom. Firstly, wisdom raises the question of how much human wisdom is related to divine wisdom. How much humility does the interpreter have to be able to say, this is my chokhmah, as opposed to, I am an extension of the ultimate chokhmah. And then secondly, it problematizes the connection between wisdom and power. And that may be what's going on here, despite the opacity that you notice, Morton. That seems to be part of what's troubling Qohelet. In verse 5, there is this reflection that every happening has a time of judgment. And the question, of course, then arises, does this time of judgment refer to the king's judgment or to the King of Kings' judgment? Right? So are we talking about a king of flesh and blood, or are we talking about God? And it is unclear and perhaps intentionally ambiguous and left to leave us considering that both are possible, that we can learn from our relationship to sovereign power about the ultimate power in the universe. We know what it's like to be a subject in within a sovereign state that's being ruled, and if you're so impudent as to get yourself into trouble, ultimately the king's judgment's going to catch up with you, and you know that as a citizen of the kingdom, then so too you should know that as a citizen of God's kingdom. That perhaps is where Qohelet is going. There's a strange reference here to sending away in verse 8. And there's a few different ways that it's being translated, but let me suggest one possibility that Alter proposes, which is sending a substitute or a delegate, a shaliach, for military service, or alternatively being released from service is what is being spoken of here. But when you look back at verse 8 and you see the way that it's described, you start to realize that there are things in life that are inescapable. Just as you cannot command the wind, just as you cannot ward off the day of death, just as you cannot ensure that there is no sending away from war. So you cannot escape the consequences of your deed, that evil consumes evil and good invites good. There was a typo there earlier on, sorry. There's a sense that you cannot escape the way that you have to operate within the kingdom. And again, Qohelet uses language of the bureaucracy of a kingdom where there is a sovereign power as a way of trying to relate to people's experience of life, and then to say, even though you can't know anything beyond the sun, look at what you can know, and look at the bureaucracy, look at the way the state is constructed, look at the way military conscription works, look at the ways that you ultimately cannot find a substitute for your own existential situation. Trying to use metaphors that people may have been familiar with in the time, we don't live in a world where we are conscripted as a matter of course, but let's say you looked at modern Israel as a parallel, where everyone understands that military service is part of what it means to be a citizen, or another country where that's the case, you suddenly realize, hold on a second, if I reach the age of 18, I know I'm being conscripted, and then once I've finished with that conscription and my tour of duty, then I have to go on miluim, then I get called back, and it's a part of your life, and you can't escape it. You can't send somebody else to do that. And if you try to escape it, you can become jailed for dodging your duty. So there is no replacement for your duty as a civilian. And Qohelet is saying also in your service of God, there's no replacement. So more, and that might be one of the reasons why so much of this is opaque, is that the metaphors that are being used are somewhat foreign to us as Canadians or as North Americans. If we lived in a world where there was a military state, it might resonate a little differently. An Israeli, for example, reading this might read it, it might resonate differently with them. That's one possibility. I want to take a look back at verse 9 and 10. In verse 9, Qohelet says, all this I have seen, even applied my heart thereto, whatever the work is that's done under the sun. Eight asher shalata adam ba'adam leralo. So here we go back to chapter 3, the whole idea of there is a time for everything under the sun. Remember that chapter? And we talked about that in terms of the way the Birds used it, and other pop artists have rendered it. But there is a time where whatever time that one person, one human being, has power over another, to be able to exert that power and to ultimately to do wrong or to do evil over that person, it's a limited time. And I've seen that this happens in the world, and I've looked and examined the power structures of the world, that whenever you seek power over another, no matter how politely you excuse it, it's ultimately, it leaves you inescapably connected to something that is evil. Power over another ultimately leads to corruption and to evil. And then he makes Qohelet makes this very strange, difficult comment to understand. One way of translating it, JPS has another way of translating it, is to say, whether the wicked brought to the grave, and from a holy place they went forth, while those who did right were forgotten in the town, this too is mere breath. So it's very opaque what's going on here. Whether you are wicked or whether you receive proper burial is something, again, as we saw in chapter 7, is something that concerns Qohelet. Let me try to share with you a couple ways of looking at that, and then we can also see if you have other ways of understanding it. But in terms of verse 9, I learned something interesting from Rami Shapiro. He suggests that there really should be 2 bumper stickers for life, or 2 notes that you put into each side of your pocket, like Zusha of Anapol used to do. But he has a different way of looking at it. He says, I'm sure you've seen those bumper stickers pasted on the back of cars. One of them says miracles happen, and the other one says, stuff happens. Okay? And in truth, the bumper sticker that reads "stuff happens" is not complete. And same thing with miracles happen. Shouldn't be on 2 different cars. It should actually be on one car. And he suggested that we really need to have a bumper sticker that says "stuff happens. What a miracle!" Right? Miracles happen, and it reminds us of all the good that we encounter, and stuff happens and it reminds us of all the crap we encounter. And life is not a matter of being able to drive one car or the other, but to realize you're driving the same car, and the bumper sticker should be on the same car. Israelis know this because they love bumper stickers. We in North America don't have such an obsession with bumper stickers, but it's great to see that you actually know what a bumper sticker is, because when I talk about it with younger students, they look at me and say, what's a bumper sticker? Believe it or not. But life is not a matter of noticing the one and avoiding the other. It's actually a matter of accepting both. The miracle is not that good stuff happens. The miracle is that anything happens at all. And Jewish spirituality and spiritual practice actually gives us a really great opportunity to figure out how to drive that car with both stickers on it. That is to say that we are supposed to recite 100 blessings every day. Mea brachot b'chol yom. Those are affirmations of gratitude for what happens to us, the miracles and the stuff during the day. There's even blessings for example, catastrophe, experiencing death, bad news, whatever it is. You have to find a way to bless it as a way of acknowledging that this is part of our experience in life, and sometimes it is despite our better judgment. Some moments are common, like blessings over food and drink, which Qohelet advocates that we enjoy. Some moments are more rare, like the blessings upon seeing a rainbow, a scholar of Torah or a secular scholar, seeing an old friend that you haven't seen for a long time. These are blessings that also make space, as I said, for the horrific and for the catastrophic. And to be able to practice a blessing each moment and every day of something that's happening to us reminds us that whatever happens to us actually is a gift. It's an opportunity, even the things we wish we could return. So that's something that we can take out of what Qohelet is suggesting. It's not explicit, but it's an interesting way of looking at it. Now, Alter suggests the holy place in verse 10, Makom Kadosh, is relates to a funeral, because the funerals that took place in ancient Israel probably took place nearby a synagogue, or around a synagogue, or perhaps like we see in Sepphoris and Peki'in, around Tiberias and the Galil, there were areas where burial took place within the tribe, and you would be buried with your ancestors. The idea was already articulated early on in Genesis, that when Abraham buys that plot in Hebron, that the idea is to be buried with your ancestors, and then it may have grown from there to be a place or close to a place of worship. So that might be what is being referred to, that is a makom kadosh, but it's absurd in Qohelet's eyes that the wicked are given a proper burial, and somehow, the other side of the equation is that the Qohelet has seen a case where the righteous are forgotten. And it begs the question, does nothing stand to reason in this world? Is there not some kind of calculus where we could say that that justice is served? How is that possible? Even in burial, Qohelet sees injustice. So one of the ways of reading it is to say, whether the wicked brought to the grave and from a holy place they went forth, while those who did right and were forgotten in the town, this too is mere breath. Now, one of the creative ways of reading this that we might consider comes from the Zohar Chadash and the Tikkunim, which is a medieval commentary, looks at it like we do and says, this is kind of opaque, right? So the language there of the Zohar is Mikra ze yesh la'ayen bo, which means, like Morton said, it's pretty opaque. It's going to require some interesting acrobatics to make sense of it. So here's a possible way of reading it in the Zohar's imagination. Now, we've looked at some Zoharic interpretation of the text before in earlier chapters, and you remember that one of the things the Zohar is very concerned about expanding in the reading of Qohelet was what? Do you remember? We talked about the architecture of a certain sphere.
The architecture of heaven.
Exactly, the architecture of Gan Eden, and the idea that there is a heaven, that there is an afterlife. This is a major concern that preoccupies the Zohar. So we were not going to be surprised to see that some of that comes up here in trying to understand this verse. So the Tikkunim in the Zohar Chadash says this verse needs further reflection. If there are indeed wicked people, Risha'im, then of course they should have no portion in the sacred realm. But Qohelet then goes on to make a distinction, that there's a difference between Resha'im Gemurim and Resha'im She'enam Gemurim. That is to say, there's a difference between those who are completely wicked through and through, and those who are simply wicked. Not sure if you've ever thought of this distinction before, but if you make that, if you parse things that way, what does that allow you to then to imagine here as a way of interpreting this verse? If there's a difference between being completely wicked and just simply wicked. Yeah, Daphne, what do you think?
Well, there's this in Plato's philosophy, when somebody's wicked and he's a leader, he's completely wicked. If somebody is not a leader, just being a only person, it cause trouble to a minimum of person. But if you're a leader, your action affect a lot of people. So it's the tyrann is he has a better hard time in heaven than the simple man.
That's interesting. Where does Plato talk about that in the Symposium?
No, uh, no.
But if you're in power and you're considered to be a tyrant, then you're considered to be completely wicked, according to Plato.
You harm more people when you're a tyrant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The only person can harm his family, a few friends, but
Uh-huh.
a tyrant can harm a lot of people.
That's very interesting to think about. So it's hard to know. I'm sure the Zohar knew the Platonic text. Maybe you'll share that with me, the source of it, next time. But it is interesting to think about the difference, and because we're also, remember, talking about um, the king and the rule of the king, as well as those who rise to power. We were looking more at the interpreters, who were the second to the king, right? The viziers or others. But there's always that problem and the risk of power that corrupts. So here, while the Zohar doesn't necessarily make that explicit connection, I'm sure that it may be in the author's mind, Daphne. So thanks for sharing that with us. That's one possibility in terms of power, but we're also looking at the architecture of the afterlife. So if that's the case, then what does this open up by saying there are those who are completely wicked and those who are just simply wicked?
Those who are completely wicked spend 100 more years in hell.
How do you know that?
No, it's a myth of Plato.
That's Plato again. Is that in the myth of Timaeus?
I don't have I have it in my book. I don't have the title.
Uh-huh. So once again, this is interesting. So in the Greek world, there's already an understanding that if you were completely wicked, it's 100 extra years to be sentenced into the netherworld, into Hades.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is not foreign at all. Now, the more that we bring it up to the way that the Hebrew imagination is trying to deal with this and to develop an architecture of the afterlife, but it comes in a different form because now it's dealing with what we spoke of earlier. The Zohar is concerned with, which is Gilgul, that is reincarnation. But it does understand there to be a Gehenom, right? That's the Hebrew word for Hades, as well as Gan Eden. So listen to the way that this opens up now. There's a difference between the completely wicked and the simply wicked one. Zohar is saying that the simply wicked actually has a portion in the realm of the holy, the Sitra de Kedusha, as well as in the realm that is Sitra de Tuma, the place of desecration or contamination. Because if you're just simply wicked, that means that your consciousness and the realms of your soul are intertwined. And that's what this verse is referring to, according to Qohelet. That the verse is referring to the Reshaim, but not to the Reshaim Gemurim, not to the completely wicked, because if the wicked is brought to the grave, they are able then to go forth from the holy place. So it's not referring to the completely wicked, because the Reshaim Gemurim, as the Zohar is saying, actually do not have any portion in the realm of the holy. But someone who is just simply wicked can be redeemed. And then the Zohar goes on to explain what that means. The Rishaim have the potential to be able to purify their desecration, and so they are lowered into this process that's called Gilgul, of reincarnation, a number of times, until they're able to purify their souls of their dross. And then goes on to give this parable and to say, what is it likened to? It's likened to an oman, to a craftsperson that has a silver vessel that's mixed with and melded to another material. What do? When you want to be able to remove that other material that is sticking to the material in an alloyed fashion, what do? You have to create white heat, and then you have to get it until the material has reached that level of heat, and then smelt it. You do that by dipping it into the kiln or into a furnace until it's smelted through the whitened hot fire. And then the Zohar goes on to conclude and suggest, in an interesting way now, making a connection with another wisdom text that hopefully we'll look at down the road, the book of Job. And Job 22:16, the Zohar says this is actually the esoteric meaning of the verse we're looking at, which is verse 10. It's explained by Job 22:16, which says, those who were snatched away before their time, whose foundation was poured out as a stream. And what is the stream? The Nahar? this is the river of fire that's spoken of in the book of Daniel, where their soul is poured out until they are cast into a new foundation. So there's another reference here to a whole other kind of architecture of the afterworld. And it's a way of trying to justify this very opaque and strange verse that says the wicked who may be buried go from a place, they go forth from a place of the holy into the holy. That is, they have the capacity to be transformed. And so also it gives us the sense that we should not be hopeless in our lives, and to realize what the rabbis would speak about as tshuva is a possibility. The Zohar doesn't use the language of tshuva, of return, but says that if it's not rectified in this world, then the rectification is possible beyond this world. That was something that I found to be intriguing. In verse 11, it goes back to, yes, Morton.
Can I just suggest a really more literal meaning of this?
Sure, please.
And that it starts with the second part of the verse, which says that those who had done right were forgotten in the city. So contrast that with the wicked. Say, so the wicked are buried and then newly come. In parallel, the newly come may be the rewritten history, shall we say, revisionist history. So someone's wicked, they're buried, and then we remember all the good things, we forget all the bad things.
That's possible, that there's a tendency for human beings to rewrite history and to revise the reputation. And of course, remember in the last chapter we saw that was important not to be forgotten. That is tov shem mishem and tov, that a good reputation is better than a fine oil or perfume, and it should be lasting and not revised. If there really truly is a sense of goodness to my reputation, then that fear of revision should be overcome. But Qohelet is saying, even so, perhaps it sometimes gets revised. But in this case, what you're saying is the revision is that someone was wicked, and that's forgotten. Yeah.
And the forgot. So I'm just thinking that it's a play on the issue of memory because of the forgotten, that the righteous are forgotten.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Excellent. A couple more things to share. Here, this goes back to the issue of theodicy, the sentence in verse 11, that the sentence for an evil act is not carried out swiftly, right? This is yet another example of Qohelet's arguments with the moral calculus of the book of Deuteronomy as well as the book of Psalms. Namely, that in many situations, that the book of Deuteronomy is suggesting that if you do good, you will prosper and the rain will fall on your land in due season, and if you do evil, you will be punished. The psalmist confronts the worldly success of the wicked and says, they're flourishing, the wicked, right? This is now a shift from Deuteronomy, which is if you do good, you'll be rewarded. The psalmist is saying, well, I see there are wicked who flourish, but it's only for a moment, and they will swiftly suffer judgment. But Qohelet's focus on empiricism, observing social and political realities, is different than the psalmists, and they both are confronted with the reality that there is a suffering in the world of the righteous. And so Qohelet looks and says, I see that the wicked often endure long in their success, and in this way they actually encourage others to emulate their evil acts. Does nothing stand to reason in this world? So it's a cry against that calculus. And perhaps it's a somewhat of a rhetorical cry, that it should be the sentence should be carried out swiftly, but for some reason it's not. And the end of the verse, though, is, though I know too that it will be well with those who fear God. And this is going to become something that by the time we get to chapter 12, we're going to return to be Yireh Elohim, or Mityareh, to have a sense of Yirah. Now, this seeming contradiction is best understood as a swing of feeling in the ambivalence that Qohelet is projecting. Who knows, as a matter of observation, that the wicked seem to, in Qohelet's lifetime, to flourish with no sign of retribution, but Qohelet wants desperately to cling to the idea that nevertheless there is some kind of divine moral order in which, in time, not swiftly, but in time, the righteous are eventually rewarded and the wicked are eventually punished. That's something Qohelet wants to try to hold on to, but the issue that we have is the issue of time. We expect it to be swift. We expect things on human terms, right? And it operates on a divine timeline rather than on human time. And that's one of the ways of resolving this issue of theodicy for Qohelet. Otherwise, Qohelet is saying, does nothing stand to reason in this world? I have to figure out a way to resolve this. And I know that if you're going to come to listen to me and we're going to gather and learn about wisdom, I better have something to say about theodicy, because everyone in the marketplace has a way of describing and explaining how to navigate these seeming injustices that we are all struggling with. And that is one of the purposes of religion. Clifford Geertz says that one of the purposes of religion, he famously said it as a anthropologist of religion, he said that the purpose of religion is to bring meaning to existence and to bring order to chaos. So it has to have a few other things in order for it to be succinct and successful and to have an afterlife beyond the life of the tribe. But if you can describe and give a kind of order to chaos, then your religion will have meaning and have lasting value. So that's why Qohelet's struggling with this. It may not be a struggle for you, Morton, but for Qohelet, it's giving Qohelet a lot of sleeplessness that is admitted to here near the end of the chapter, that it will lead you to a lot of sleeplessness, right? Marion, did you have a question?
I did. You know, the way the Zohar brings, the way you spoke about the meaning that comes out of the Zohar, it sounded like what they were trying to say is that redemption is related to realized potentialities. So that, but if we then the part of what we've just discussed about time makes realized potentialities, makes us even more helpless, in the sense that we have only a certain amount of time in which we can realize the things that perhaps might redeem us. And
yes, but
and even if we try, circumstances might be such that we can't in our lifetime.
That's right. And that's the reason why the Zohar then proposes Gilgul, to say your realized potentiality may have to take place over a number of lifetimes. That's a way of trying to make the calculus work, right? So yes, that's a good way to put it. When we go to 15 and 16, I'll just close with this and then open it for questions and discussion and observations that you may have about the chapter as a whole. But Qohelet again praises, as Bev noticed, praises the things that we can hold on to. And specifically here, Simcha and Tov, Shtia and Achila, right? So it's about rejoicing. It's about the good things that we can enjoy, to eat and to drink, to eat what we eat and to drink what we drink, and to be able to enjoy it. So it's a praise for joy and for merriment, which sounds again a little bit hedonistic, which doesn't seem to fit with Qohelet's earlier recommendation that it's better to go to a house of mourning than it is to a tavern. But maybe the food at the Shiva is more enjoyable than it is at a tavern, because you know it's fleeting, and at a tavern it's constantly flowing. I mean, it's a contradiction, but it's interesting though, because people do find solace in eating together at a Shiva, and the food tastes different at a Shiva than it does at a wedding, right? And we noticed that earlier as well in some of the comments that we made. But I think this is an example of a particular affirmation of the tangible pleasures of the senses. And it's probably a response in some ways to the articulation of life's moral absurdity in the preceding verses before 15. Because in this insubstantial fleeting existence that is really a mere breath, we cannot make heads or tails of any calculus in our own time frame of reward and punishment, now or later, even if we say that realized potentiality for the Zohar is in a different incarnation. So Qohelet ultimately is saying the best thing you can do is enjoy what you have now. Eat what you eat and enjoy it. drink what you drink and enjoy it. And as I said, the rabbinic layer on this would say then, Mea brachot b'chol yom. Make each moment an encounter of blessing, a moment of gratitude, a moment of awareness that what is here in this moment is meant to be enjoyed, and ultimately it's the product of your own work, but you're meant to enjoy it. And then, as we saw at the beginning, pesher davar, in terms of the interpreter who can apply their wisdom for great power in the world, don't forget that God is part of that equation. So in the same way, don't forget that when you eat what you eat and you drink what you drink, that God is part of that equation, and that your enjoyment is in many ways granted to you by God, but your gratitude should be a way of reconnecting you to its source. That's the most that Qohelet can give us to hold on to try to overcome sleeplessness. And that's interesting, right? Is that at the end of this chapter in verse 16, Qohelet has this expression, which is interesting. That is at the end of 16, we would call it 16b, is ki gam bayom uvalayla shena be'inav einenu ra'eh, right? That there is no limit, and you can realize that you cannot reduce the whole to the limit of the part, and day and night you remain ultimately sleepless. And here, Alter suggests that the idea of this sleepless pursuit of wisdom is appropriate for Qohelet's repeated affirmation of this dedication to the philosophical investigation of life. But remember, there are also limits to that as well, right? That eventually, if you allow it to take you too far, you may ultimately never be able to sleep, and that no ordinary person can really fathom the ultimate way under the sun that we spoke of earlier. And this is a way of also dissuading people from getting too caught up in philosophy by suggesting that even though if the wise pretends to know, ultimately that person may not be able to fully understand, right? Even if they pretend to know, that person will not be able to grasp the totality of it. That's the stress that we should be making there, not to be able to grasp the entirety of the matter. So how does this relate to the earlier challenge we posed from last week's chapter in terms of looking at wisdom and the feminine, the wisdom that's described as the symbol of the feminine in Proverbs, in that section, chapters 1 through 9, as opposed to chapter 31, verses 11 through 31. Did you have any reflections on that before we close? Remember the distinction that was being made between the two different types of symbols of women. The woman of wisdom, who is the Eshet Chayil in 31:11, has a certain kind of value. Eshet Chayil mi'imtza, mirachok mipnini mi'imtza. She is considered to be more valuable than rubies, as opposed to the seductress, who is spoken about in chapters 1 through 9, who leads us astray, who is the antithesis of having any value whatsoever. But we can be drawn to either symbols of wisdom as a woman, and the question is which is the symbol that we're supposed to be drawn to? Which is the way in which we're supposed to walk? Marian?
The end of chapters of verse 16 makes you think that it's not that the pursuit of wisdom itself is not in here in Ecclesiastes. It's not necessarily an eros. It's not a pursuit of a passion. It's a pursuit of desperation. It's a pursuit of real desperate straits, rather than it's a different level of motivation.
And why do you think that is? Why is Qohelet reaching this place of saying you'll never be full, right? Because philosophy, philosophia, Daphne, what's the way we understand in Plato what philosophia is supposed to be? Miriam was referring to it when you in your comment earlier. But what's the definition of philosophy according to Plato?
Well, it's we can say it's an exercise of dying. So when we die, the soul separates from the body. So when we live, we must do that separation the way we can by seeing with our soul and looking at the soul and put the body away. So it's an exercise of dying. That's the way you.
Right, that's true, but there's also an element of eros that's connected to it, isn't there?
Yeah, the arrows for a teacher or for a person, the person needs to transfer the eros to the eros of knowledge.
Exactly.
But it's never knowledge first, it's always a person.
Uh-huh. So that's an interesting distinction. That it's right, it's never knowledge first, it's the person. And here, what's the inverted calculus or channel that Qohelet is describing? It's not a person first, but it's actually God.
Yeah, but to go to God, maybe we need a person, but that's maybe a Christian idea. But some people say so.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not present here, and the fact that Pesher Davar refers to Daniel and to Joseph strengthens the idea that it's not through a person, but it's the person's direct connection with God. So that is a distinction. Bev?
One observation from at the end of the chapter, my feeling is there's supposed to be things about God that you'll never know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a given. And if you're going to try to search for it at all, then there's this problem with sleeplessness and trying to. But in fact, one of the essences of God is there are things that are unknown. So people ask questions like, how can you have catastrophes if God
Right.
is all good, etc.?
Right.
But these are questions that can't be answered by man.
Okay.
That's one observation. But something earlier that Fabienne said, the difference between the wicked and the truly wicked,
Mm-hmm.
100 years. Well, in terms of eternity, what's 100 years? You know, I mean, if the truly wicked get 100 extra and then they end up in the same place as.
Go back to work. They go back.
So that doesn't seem like a big punishment, you know?
No, but Fabienne, you're saying though that what happens after that 100-year sentence in Hades? What do they do?
They come back to the reincarnate.
Yeah, so there's already a sense of reincarnation in that Greek myth. So you're right. There has to still be justice even in the afterlife, and that's why reincarnation becomes appealing. Marian?
I would say, in the JPS translation, around just before verse 6 and a little bit after,
Mm-hmm.
there's a mention. The translation mentions that there's a time of doom. And when I was trying to think what would really give someone sleeplessness, this is a kind of emotional state of being distraught, is the idea maybe that we can never ever know, that we are absolutely doomed to never ever knowing. That would be so, not just, it would be terrifying, but also really is a place of more than abandonment. It's a catastrophe.
Mm-hmm. The catastrophe of limiting what we can know. It's possible, but the language, I'm not sure I agree with that translation, because the language in the Hebrew that I translated here as a time of judgment following altar is yesh et umishpat. So to say that it's a time of doom, it's possible, but I'm not sure that it holds in terms of the rest of what's being spoken about here in terms of the king and the king's way and the king's judgment. So you have to, sometimes when we look at these translations, try to look at it contextually and see, even though JPS may have a good reason to say it's a time of doom, I don't think it fits in the context of the rest of this quandary about what to do with the king. So I'm less inclined to go that route, but your interpretation of it is interesting. I'm just not sure that it's a strong translation. So that's something to think about. That is where we get to as we conclude chapter 8. So thank you for joining us for that section.